Welcome back to the Pedagogy Podcast. I'm so excited to welcome Phoenix Rosewood to the podcast today. Welcome, Phoenix.
Thanks for having me, Vanessa.
Okay, I'm going to start with a little bit of an introduction, and then we will dive right into this conversation today. So Phoenix is a psychotherapist, educator, and soon-to-be PhD in counselor education and supervision with over 14 years of clinical experience. Their work centers on trauma recovery, attachment, and the relational aspects of shame, power, and rupture, especially within transgender, queer, and racially and ethnically targeted communities. Phoenix is deeply invested in multicultural and social justice-oriented counselor education, with particular attention to how systems, politics, and institutional harm shape mental health and learning. In their private practice, they offer consultation and clinical supervision, training in conduct research related to trauma-informed and liberatory approaches to supervision and organizational change. Their current research includes qualitative and participatory projects focused on relational endurance, repair, and counselor preparedness. Across all their work, Phoenix is committed to helping individuals and institutions stay in the room when growth, accountability, and justice are on the line. They have 2 dogs and a 15-month-old baby and live next to a wild blueberry hill in western Massachusetts. So welcome, Phoenix.
Thank you, Vanessa.
I'm so excited to talk with you today on the podcast. I thought maybe a good starting point for our listeners today would be to talk a little bit about what brought you to teaching in higher ed, a little bit about your own teaching journey.
Yeah. The first thought I had when you asked me the question was, I'm just really bossy. Like I'm an eldest sibling I have 3 siblings who are younger than me. And just like looking back on our development and our relationships, like I just really like to tell people what to do. And I'd like to think that it comes from a helpful, resourceful place. And certainly I've had to learn to like harness and cultivate that skill. So there's that. There's just like the underlying part of who I am, which is bossy. But also I think, as I became a counselor and started working in the field, I just became really aware of this like thirst to enact as much change, transformation, support as possible. And certainly that happens in the room with clients, with supervisees, with colleagues. Like I believe relationship is a conduit to healing, can be. But I'm also like a real meta thinker. My neurocomplexity sort of is like constantly pushing me into like more meta conversations, mostly with myself. And so just in following those interests, I had it reflected back to me like, have you ever thought about becoming a counselor educator? And I was like, no. Did I get to boss people around? And, of course not. But that I was lucky to have a few counselor educators in my journey who, in different ways, really embodied like radical truth telling and were really interested in disrupting systems. And at the end of the day, like I really want to disrupt systems. And so I think that has kind of led me to where I am today. And, into the classroom has just been such a powerful vehicle for deeper connection with students, for my own learning. Like when I'm teaching, I'm actually such a better therapist. Um, and I just get to be really inspired by the students that I work with and their clients.
Hmm. You say bossy, and I so much of what I heard you kind of describing there, especially when you're talking about your siblings, but then thinking about maybe client work and working with students is like a guide.
Yeah.
Is that I think this is one of the things that I've seen you do over time is you know how to ask the right questions in a way that guides people to where they need to be. So I'm fine with the word bossy, you know, that's cool too. But I think
Yes.
I love watching you in action as you kind of guide and facilitate. And so when you were just talking now, you talked about thinking about, and maybe this is where some of the term bossy, I think, might come into play, is thinking about the disruption of systems.
Mm.
And so tell me a little bit about, because there's an urgency there. So sorry that I didn't make the connection. There's an
Right.
urgency. And so that's where it's like, oh, well, I need to, like, let's tell people what to do so that we can disrupt these systems really quickly because we need to. Um, what does that look like in the classroom when you think about disrupting systems? So working with students in relation to disrupting systems, what does that look like?
You know, I think it's just like, kind of refined, evolved, devolved over the years. But I think right now it really looks like embodying my whole person. And that doesn't mean that I'm self-disclosing like all over myself with students, but it's like, for example, it's always locating myself in the beginning of a class. And so, that can sound like, I'm Phoenix Rosewood. I use they, them pronouns. I am white. I am femme presenting. I am from Arizona. Like, we could sort of go through that rote list, which can be powerful. Or there's the narrative version where, it can be a little bit more poetic, more embodied, a little bit more fluid, and also tailored to who's in the room with me.
Hmm.
I think I try to bring in the praxis of preemptive radical inclusion, or PRI, which is this fantastic term that actually a local activist, Phoebe Beale, who I think is a Unitarian minister, maybe the editor could fact check that, um, came up with, which is just basically like, I don't ever want to presume who's in the room with me.
Hmm.
I don't want to presume to know your experiences. I don't want to presume that you are able-bodied when you look a certain way or don't look a certain way, or I don't want to presume your gender or race, or experiences with education. And so I think some educators might look at location of self practices as, I've heard it as like indulgent, or it just like takes so much time and we've got stuff to do. But I want students to hear their professor who is in a position of power say, like, here are the ways I'm plugged in to systems of privilege and power, and here are the ways that the systems don't serve me. And I honor that this is all real.
Hmm.
Like, I don't want to gaslight you in this experience. And so I think that that's one way that students have shared with me, like just feeling a little bit more at ease, comfortable. I think another way is using humor. Like, uh, so an example of this is, as I think about my dissertation defense, dissertation being about, what happens when we wish we could put a, sock in our mouth after we say something insensitive, or, just are a human being and accidentally enact a microaggression or hurt somebody's identity. And like, I'm just thinking about the level of shame activation. Like, the moment that I say microaggression, um, most people's brains are just going to go offline. The moment that I say the word shame, I mean, the research shows this, it's like immediate flood response. Just saying the word shame. And so I'm thinking about, okay, how do I keep people within a general window of tolerance such that they can absorb, consider some of this really important information while also recognizing that we've got to resource and sustain. And like speaking to the urgency of the moment, Vanessa, like, there's so much urgency. And also I think to be able to model a nervous system that is attentive, present, non-responsive to white fragility, meaning invested in challenging that, even if it means, especially when it means creating conflict, so that we can reckon with that and get to the other side of that. And then practice, practice, practice. So I think that I think my approach tends to be yes, embodied, yes, very in the moment experiential. And at the same time, I'm like, these are the skills that we need as advocates. These are the specific ways that you can use your degree to, talk at the state house or, give statements on public policy. Here are the research journals that would be, really interesting for you to contribute to. And so, like, I think talking with students about where they see themselves plugging into this vast network of counselors and counselor educators who are really seeking liberation work.
Hmm.
That was like so much.
It was so much. It was so much. And I want to talk about every aspect of it. I mean, this happens every time on the podcast is yes, there was so much, but I'm going to pull a few
Great.
things. So let
Yes.
me do that. Okay. So you talked a little bit about like how we actually enter the classroom with students. And I loved what you said around kind of thinking about positionality and power. And that some folks, and it can be this way in many cases, depending on how it's done, is that it is like can be self-indulgent or um, uh, like a narrative kind of presentation or a presentation of positionality and acknowledging power dynamics in the classroom doesn't always work, but it often does in a way that can really lay the foundation for what type of intentional space you're trying to create with students that is like much more relational. And
Mm-hmm.
so that to me is something to learn, like in the use the word model when you were talking, to actually model the work so that we're not just talking about these kind of theoretical paradigms, but we're exercising them and practicing even when it's uncomfortable and hard or can create conflict in the classroom in ways that actually is part of transformative education.
Mm-hmm.
That's so beautiful. It's so beautiful and really hard and very rare to do that. Um,
Yeah, it requires a lot of internal resource and like investment.
yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was reading your bio and some of the past conversations that we have is something that I know is in your own kind of intellectual interest, but also in your clinical work and in your work in the classroom is really about trauma and
Mm-hmm.
trauma in the classroom. And, kind of one of the hot topics in the scholarship of teaching and learning the past few years is trauma informed pedagogy as we talk about it. I just
Yeah.
want to hear, let's go there.
Yeah.
Wherever that takes you,
Yeah.
I want to hear your reflections.
Yeah. Whenever I hear trauma informed pedagogy, my like ADHD mind goes to TI, and then I think about the rapper, and then like I have this whole skit that plays in my head about the performer teaching. Anyway, but that's not what we're here to talk about.
Well, we can talk about that too, because,
I mean, it's a
yeah,
great fantasy.
it is.
Um, yeah, I mean, I don't know how to quantify it easily, I guess the way I would, yeah, the way I would want my students to understand how it looks, because that's who it's for. We're talking about tailoring a trauma informed approach in service of our students. It's about establishing collaborative conditions that facilitate connection through self reflection, engagement with peers, engagement with faculty and through discomfort. And I think I really want to spend time on like the risk taking and discomfort, because I think that, you know, the term safety, especially psychological safety, gets thrown around a lot. And I think it unfortunately gets either consciously or unconsciously weaponized, oftentimes by white people, about like, this doesn't feel safe. Learning about XYZ makes me feel triggered and I don't feel safe. And so I think it's really important, first and foremost, that when we're providing informed consent as educators, right? Like I say, like, you know, by staying in this class, like you're agreeing to the syllabus, you know, you're agreeing to the terms of our relational contract as we've discussed. And part of that looks like us differentiating between what feels like discomfort and what is unsafe.
Hmm.
And I don't define that for my students. And that's really hard. And I think that that is often where I'll just speak for myself as an instructor. I have to really stay in the room and I have to really take a deep breath and ground myself, is because as a counselor, educator, as a white person, as a socialized female person, there's this narrative of like, I don't want to cause harm here. And as you know, also, like, we're not always in control of that. We're not. And how do we define harm? And who gets to define harm? And whose comfort are we centering when we talk about harm? And so I think the trauma informed piece has more. I wish that there was a more explicit marriage between trauma informed and like anti white supremacy, or like this is multiculturally responsive and trauma informed, right?
As you were talking, what I was thinking about was exactly what you said at the end, which was, you know, in some of these conversations around trauma-informed pedagogy, I think one of the things that is often missing for me is the structural, so that it becomes very rooted in individual responses. And what you said around whose trauma, who's defining harm, what does that look like, who's uncomfortable in the classroom, um, what does that mean? And I know with working with students, often, you know, I encourage them when this relates to what you were saying before and your response to your first question around your teaching journey too, is we don't enter the classroom as empty vessels. We enter as whole humans, both as teachers and students and co-learners and collaborators. And so when I think about trauma informed pedagogy, I think and to be honest, I think I'm still grappling with the term. Yeah, I want to think more about
Yeah.
that term. Yeah,
Yeah. What comes up for you when you hear trauma informed pedagogy?
that it zooms in on individuals, and that I hope that we keep talking about the systems. Like, what are the systems and the structures that reproduce both harm and trauma, like collective senses of trauma? What does that mean? How education systems in my students often talk about this and love the conversation around who were these institutions built for? How do educational institutions on a structural level reproduce harm,
Mhm.
and are exclusionary? And so to how we navigate the kind of individual responses or some of the knee-jerk responses in classrooms, that are very real. I also, yeah, my intention is not to dismiss those responses, and what feels uncomfortable and what is really hard in the classroom, but how to think about those things alongside each other.
Yeah, it's not mutually exclusive, right? Like that's what I'm hearing you say. And I think sometimes we can get bogged down in, and it honestly feels like very white supremacy culture, right? Is like this over intellectualizing, over defining, getting lost in the weeds of like, okay, like in a sense, it doesn't matter. Like the structural inequalities are being reproduced and enacted in the classroom all the time. So if we can't address those, there's no point in addressing these.
Yes, that's such a better way of trying to say what I was trying of saying what I was trying to say. Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Hmm.
Hmm.
Yes. Oh. Okay, Phoenix.
Okay.
Let's keep going. Let's keep going.
Okay, great.
Tell me a little bit about, as you're thinking about the classrooms that you want to create, the classrooms that you're facilitating and navigating with students, what has been in either an inspiration for you in creating those classrooms, or who, that could be a who, and what has been challenging in trying to create those spaces?
Yeah. Well, I guess I can just speak as a Gemini, which is my other identity, being bossy and also a Gemini. Watch out, world.
Don't those go
Um,
together? I don't know. No?
I think that gets a little messy. I think
Oh,
you'd have to ask my family if they go
okay.
together.
All right. All right.
Um, but my favorite teacher of all times was my English teacher in high school. Her name was Christine Sedaris. I'm not sure if she's still with us today. She was this sort of like amazing Greek woman who I don't actually know what her gender identity was. She used she, her pronouns, but she had long hair and she had big, what I would associate like pretentious circular glasses. And she would wear a sweater vest and a bow tie. And I mean, I think that I was very fixated on like the who of Christine Sedaris so much. And I think there's more to unpack there, but related to her style, like she was the first teacher that I had that recognized that you could go out of state to college if you want. I lived in a part of Arizona where Central Phoenix, and it was like a lower working class neighborhood, and a lot of like first gen college students or soon to be college students. And so folks went to the universities of, ASU, U of A, NAU, which are all great universities. And there seemed to be this like disconnect between seeing that there were schools outside of Arizona. And so she had flags along the top of her classroom wall from every single college that any of her students had ever gone to. And I probably spent so much time, not reading Beowulf or whatever, and just like looking at those flags. And that coupled with how rigorous she was, like she had extremely high expectations. I experienced her as very harsh. She loved me, but I'm also a teacher's pet. And shocker. Um, and I didn't like the way that she showed up relationally with students that she didn't think were, I think, deserving of her time and energy. So she was like a very complicated whole human. But I loved the rigor of her, and I loved just like her embodiment of her, which, like, by the way, dressing the way that she was dressing in central Arizona, like huge home to like fundamentalist Christians, LDS, very, very, very conservative area at the time. It just was pretty radical. So just like her being was radical. So there's that. So the academic rigor. And then I think like I have always like home was never really, I never felt a sense of belonging at home. I do now with my family that I live with, but school always felt like belonging to me. Like I always felt mirrored. My passions were always affirmed. And then like I always had friends who were smarter than me and just like taught me so much. And so I think to me, I see belonging as a core ingredient or component in social emotional learning, but like especially when we think about becoming counselors, becoming people who are supposed to be very adept at building relationships. if we don't have that sense of belonging, and for a lot of my students, they look outside of their lives and they don't feel a strong sense of belonging for various reasons. And so like if the classroom can attempt to be both rigorous and also facilitate belonging, to me that's like the best of both worlds.
Hmm. Rigorous and facilitate belonging. And what I heard you say about the flags hanging was also her willingness to offer up the possibilities. So there's something about
Possibilities,
like
yeah,
seeing you in the classroom, um, and also saying, hey, there's so much that's possible. I think that's beautiful. I think that is. It's too bad that again we're complex people of um, some of the ways maybe that wasn't offered to all students. But this is what we see. I mean, this is the reproduction of
hmm
harm in some ways in the classroom. Um,
hmm
but that you were able to look at those flags and think, oh, what does this mean? Like there's something out there, and there's something beyond like what's immediately in front of me that I think is part of the hopefully the liberatory power of education.
absolutely.
That's very beautiful. That's very beautiful. As you've been talking, you mentioned a little bit about who you were in your own learning spaces, and then we talked about the classrooms now that you try to create. I have so many questions. I have so many questions. But
I'm here.
one of the
Here.
things that we have talked about and has kind of just peeked its head in this conversation is around neurodivergence, accessibility in the classroom. Um, how does that show up for you as a teacher?
I mean, I think that the piece of feedback I'm always humbled by and also trying to integrate is like too much. You like give us way too much content. Just you know, um, maximalism everywhere. And I think that that speaks to my passion, and I think that speaks to my neurodivergence. Like
Mm,
I think there's a world where if I've created syllabi and I've created courses, and like for example, we did not have a sexuality course offered in our counseling program. So I made a human sexuality class with the focus on counseling gender and sexual minorities. It was an 8-week class, Vanessa. Like, do you know how packed I made that syllabus? It was like, here is literally every single thing on queerness, on gender, on kink and BDSM. Like, and that came from also an earnest recognition that we need more providers that are compassionate and competent. And so it comes from this anxiety, this urgency, but I think this pattern recognition, I think that you and I have talked about before, where it's like, alert, alert, we need all of these things out there. But what I continue to try to work on is like, okay, not everybody gets from A to Z in the way that I get there. And so I
mhm.
need to do a better job of constructing scaffolding and bridges and, like comfortable walks to get to Z. And that not everything's going to be covered. Of course it's not. Of course it's not. And I could not do that. But it's that I think that pattern recognition coupled with passion and the confines of our systems that, yeah, for my own brain and neural circuitry, like I often feel very thwarted.
Yeah, and also I mean, you have so much to offer. You know all these things. You know what's needed. That comes back to where we started today about wanting to disrupt systems. And so
Yes,
you want that to happen, and we need knowledge and information for that to happen. So you're seeking to, provide that to your students. But yes, a semester, you can only do so much.
Do you have that as well?
What, that I teach too much? Like, or I assign too much material?
Yeah, yeah. I'm
I
curious.
I used to, maybe when I
Hmm.
first started, but it's funny
Hmm.
because I'm dyslexic, I think I do the opposite. Because I have learned over time that there is only so much I can do in the semester, that reading is really hard. I would say both because I'm dyslexic and because I've had so many students say to me over time, this is too much material. Can we take a step back? Like, I can't read that much. And so I think I've found ways to navigate that over time. But that took me a, a lot of teaching to figure out how to do that. But I don't know, ask my students, but I think they'd say, with exception of yesterday, but I told them yesterday, I told them last week, hey, this is the heaviest reading week of the semester. You're going to need a little extra time to get
Hmm.
through these two readings. Otherwise, I try to be really specific about how much I'm assigning. And it's like what you said, the scaffolding. It's the scaffolding and the bridge work in teaching. I love that work. Again, I think that's probably part of, like, attached to my dyslexic brain, is like, I love the this is the big picture
Yeah.
at the beginning, and then what are the different pieces that we need to kind of get there. And then each week I do, or each class actually, and each week I do a, this is what we just did, this is where we are, and this is where we're going. To
Ooh,
It's hard. That's hard to do. Yeah.
I love that, Vanessa. How do your students respond to that?
They love it cuz then it's like having a map. It's like when you're driving and you don't know where you're going, and
Yeah.
I don't know, for some people it can be
Yes,
really, dysregulated, and you're like,
for
shoot,
sure.
do I take a, and if someone, you have a co-pilot next to you, you're asking them, what's next, like, am I
Yes.
taking a right up there, and then what happens after that? Like, people want to know, like, what's the destination and
Yeah.
what's the next step in the destination. And so I think that's one of the ways I navigate that with students, in terms of, I mean, that answered maybe multiple questions, thinking about both neurodivergence, mine, theirs, but then also, like, how we, yeah, navigate those different things alongside one another. So some of that's responsive, some of that's like my own needs and desires in the classroom, my own kind of hopes and dreams for students about um, what it is I'm hoping they learn, um, and how we get there.
I mean, I hate to burst your bubble, but that also sounds trauma informed.
It is. Okay, but why? Why do you think that sounds
Well,
trauma informed?
because you're producing the variables called transparency. So you're acknowledging that there's a power hierarchy that exists, right? Like we can pretend it doesn't, but it exists whether we pretend. So we can just name that. And so we're in control of where we're taking the ship ultimately because we have objectives we need to impart based on the curriculum and accreditation. So you're letting people know where you're headed, which produces reliability. 81% of counseling students in master's programs have experienced trauma themselves. I'm not sure what the numbers are on an undergraduate level. I would presume something similar, or if not greater. So, like, students have very real anxieties about, like, what's expected of me. Like, where are we going with this material? Because so much of our educational system, unfortunately, has traumatized people in little ways and in big ways. But like this sense of gotcha, you
Yes.
know, it's
Yes.
like there will never be a gotcha, in my class. And that's what I'm hearing from you, is that you're preparing your students. You're also condensing. You're also you're mentalizing and making concrete what was just learned. And that act in and of itself, when you feed it to students, actually helps them metabolize and store it more readily in their brain so they don't have to like go back in the Rolodex. So you're doing many things actually that facilitate trauma informed learning. And we can't divorce that from a disability justice or mad justice pedagogy as well.
No. Well, thank you for that affirmation. I mean, I aim to be, to create these classrooms for students, but I love what you said. I'm going to pick up on two threads. One is the gotcha. I always say to my students, like, I'm not here to trick you. One, I'm not here, you're not going to get everything. Like, the goal is not to get every single detail of whether that's the reading or the lecture. Like, it's just not humanly possible, actually. Maybe for one or two people that is possible.
Right.
But the goal is not to trick you in this process. That's not part of, or that should not be part of learning, but it is in many cases because of power dynamics in the classroom. And
Hmm.
the other thread that where you ended there was about neuroscience. So, next question, Phoenix, is about you. What you just named was about how we learn. How we learn. What facilitates learning, like on the kind of on a neurological level, um, and how students can retain information, and how that is connected to the classrooms that we create.
Hmm.
So, how does
Yeah.
that inform your approach?
Well, I just think about everything that's happening, outside of our little windows here, Vanessa. And like, if I were teaching right now, I think it would be really hard to jump into, I mean, frankly, any class, but like if I'm teaching social cultural diversity, like, how could I not acknowledge what's happening, in our communities? How could I not talk about ICE? How could I not talk about the levels of traumatization? And I think that that gets tricky because we're not there to facilitate group therapy, unfortunately. Um, I actually don't want to facilitate group therapy with my students. So it's like figuring out the most direct but also meta way of naming a thing that is activating, giving the students an opportunity maybe to pair share, maybe to do some quick writing. Like one practice that I'll invite people to do is borrowed from this counseling theory called focusing, which is like what's getting in the way between you and feeling alert and present right now. And so people can go internally, they can do it with a partner, they can write it down, they can create art, but it gives students an opportunity to practice compartmentalization, which as counselors is like a very necessary tool. And when I say compartmentalization, I'm not saying complete disconnection. Like, I cannot take what's happening outside in the world and leave it at my counseling door. Um, and so I think some of that is embodied practice that students have to build those muscles and reflexes. And this is like a perfect opportunity for that. So I think to be able to acknowledge our students as whole beings impacted by what's happening, that's critical. I also think getting students, like, letting students become aware of expectations. It's always surprising to me how many students I have that will like read through the syllabus, sort of like do all of the work, in the first couple of weeks of class, and then get to the final assignment and they're like, am I going to be evaluated? And so I think having conversations about evaluation, assessment, what they can expect from me with feedback, all of that serves to create predictability, create consistency, create transparency, address power dynamic, and through that, start to mediate the anxiety around performance. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that makes me think about a past conversation that we've had about grading
Mm.
and what actually motivates students.
Right.
how grading and assessment can get in the way of that performance because it creates a sense of anxiety and really is about, well, it's about many things that we don't have time to get into today, unfortunately. Maybe we'll come back to this. But so much of that is about the mapping of expectations, communication, um, and that how those, how grading and assessment can just be such a block for students, um, in terms of what they're able to actually learn in the classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and counseling's this like interesting kind of liminal field because it's not computer science, or like physics. Um, and it's not like completely experiential. There is this necessary marriage of being able to retain, knowing how to do assessment, diagnosis, the sort of history and development of different theory, and then the application. Um, and it's a constant conversation in counselor education is like, how do we grade students on counseling skills who have never done counseling, who have never been counselors? How do we effectively do that? And, thank goodness that's above my pay grade. I don't have to come up with the answers to that. But I honor the complexity in all of that. And I think the student's anxiety mirrors that
Yeah.
unknown.
Yeah. And it sounds like you find ways in your own classroom to navigate that,
Mm-hmm,
you are required to have grades and assessment,
mm-hmm,
but that you can curate the approach to that in your own
mm-hmm.
classroom in a way that aligns with your own pedagogy, the learning environment you're trying to create. It's very trauma informed, Phoenix.
DI over here.
Oh, um, oh, this is so great. So, I think we're, coming close to an end in our conversation. As you think about um, your next chapter in teaching, where you're headed with your own teaching, what are some of your own goals and hopes and dreams for your future classrooms?
Hmm. Oh, well, I really see myself getting to be in academic community as an instructor for instructors. So my hope would be to teach primarily in a doctoral program in counselor education and supervision. Um, Mostly because I love the ontological construct of pedagogy and how that facilitates so much. But um, so I hope to be doing that. I hope to be able to collaborate with different students on different research projects that are meaningful for them. Um, I want to have fun. Like I would love to continue to center joy as resistance and adapt the classroom to how it might need to be adapted and adapt curriculum to how it might need to be adapted in order to, be of service to the folks sitting in those seats, and serving the communities that are needing to be served. So I hope there's a lot of fluidity and flexibility. And like part of what I take heart in is like, we don't actually know how this is going to go in higher ed. I mean, anybody who says they know doesn't know. And so I'm betting on possibility.
Oh, that's a beautiful way to wrap up. Betting on possibility. There's so much possibility. Every time we talk, I just feel really encouraged and inspired and hopeful about what's next, what the possibilities of, yeah, working with students can be, what that opens up. Um, and this continued kind of disruption that there where we started today, thinking about what it means to disrupt. So, Phoenix, thank you so much for taking the time to join me on the podcast today.
Yeah, Vanessa, it's, ditto right back to you. I feel so energized when we get to talk, and I'm just so heartened by the work that you're doing, so much work that you're doing on so many levels. And Yeah, I just love that you got to have me on to gab about my favorite subject. So thank you.
Let's keep doing that. Let's keep gabbing in the future. So,
Sounds good.
all right, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the podcast today. Make sure to click the like button and subscribe, and we will see you next time.